Elijah Cole had not eaten since yesterday morning, and the hunger was making his fingers shake. He stood at the back entrance of the Whitmore Performing Arts Center, clutching a crumpled registration slip in his left hand, staring at the heavy glass doors like they were the gates to another world. Because they were. Inside, chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with angels. Outside, where Elijah stood, a dumpster overflowed with yesterday's garbage and the sidewalk was cracked in 6 places. He was 12 years old. His shoes had holes in them. And in exactly 47 minutes, he was supposed to walk onto the biggest stage in the city and play piano in front of 300 strangers. The security guard at the door looked at him the way people always looked at him, eyes moving down from his face to his clothes, then back up again, then away. Elijah had learned to read that look before he learned to read books. It said, "You do not belong here." "You lost, kid?" the guard asked. Elijah held up his registration slip. The guard took it, turned it over, checked the number, and frowned. "Contestant 61, Elijah said quietly. The guard stared at him for another second, then stepped aside without a word. Elijah walked through those doors and into a world he had only ever seen on screens. The lobby floor was white marble, polished so clean he could see his own reflection looking back at him, and he did not like what he saw. A skinny boy in a faded blue polo shirt that used to belong to someone else, pants that were too short by 2 inches, shoes that were held together more by habit than by material. Around him, other contestants moved through the lobby like they had been born in places like this. Boys in pressed blazers with their hair combed smooth, girls in dresses that still had the tags removed that morning, parents carrying instrument cases and folders of sheet music, talking on phones about parking and dinner reservations. Nobody talked to Elijah. Nobody even noticed him. He found a seat in the back corner of the waiting area, pressed himself into it, and tried to become invisible. It was a skill he had practiced his whole life, and he was very good at it. His mother, Grace Cole, did not know he was here. She was at work right now, on her knees scrubbing bathroom floors at the Regency Hotel on the other side of town. She worked the morning shift and the evening shift, 6 days a week. And on Sundays she slept so deeply that Elijah sometimes checked to make sure she was still breathing. She would not have let him come here. Not because she did not believe in him, but because she could not afford to believe in things that might break her heart. Elijah had found out about the competition 3 months ago. A flyer stapled to a telephone pole outside the corner store near his apartment. The Whitmore Young Musicians Showcase. Open to contestants aged 10 to 16. First prize, $5,000 and a performance slot at the city's annual arts festival. Entry fee, $50. $50. To most of the kids in this lobby, that was pocket change. To Elijah, it was a mountain. He started saving the day he saw that flyer. He collected aluminum cans from the park and the alley behind his building, and crushed them flat, and carried them in garbage bags to the recycling center, where a tired man with a beard weighed them and handed over coins. He swept the front steps for Mrs. Patterson on the 2nd floor. He carried groceries for old Mr. Holloway across the street. He found coins in gutters, between couch cushions in the church basement, under vending machines at the laundromat, nickels, dimes, quarters, the occasional crumpled dollar bill. He kept it all in a sock under his mattress, and every night before he slept he counted it. It took him 11 weeks. The morning registration closed. He walked 4 miles to the arts center and paid in a sandwich bag full of coins and small bills. The woman at the desk had counted it 3 times, then looked at him with an expression he could not quite name. Pity, maybe. Or maybe something softer than that. Now he was here, and the hunger in his stomach was nothing compared to the fear crawling up his spine. He pressed his hands flat against his thighs to stop them from trembling. He closed his eyes and did what he always did when the world got too loud and too heavy. He played piano in his mind. He heard the notes before he felt them. Chopin, the Ballade No. 1 in G minor. He had learned it the way he had learned everything about music, alone, in silence, with nothing but a cracked phone screen, and an old piano that was missing the felt on half its hammers. That piano lived in the basement of the Greater Hope Community Church, 4 blocks from Elijah's apartment. It was a donated upright, probably 50 years old, with a water stain across the top and 3 keys that stuck when the weather was humid. Nobody played it anymore. The church used an electric keyboard for Sunday services, and the old piano sat in the basement gathering dust, forgotten by everyone except Elijah. He had discovered it when he was 7. His mother used to drop him at the church's after-school program while she worked her second job. The other kids played basketball in the parking lot or watched cartoons in the fellowship hall. Elijah wandered. One afternoon he found the basement door unlocked, walked down the concrete stairs, and saw the piano sitting against the far wall under a bare light bulb. He pressed a key. The sound that came out was thin and slightly out of tune, but it moved through him like electricity. He pressed another key, then another. Within 10 minutes he was sitting on the bench, both hands on the keyboard, picking out a melody he had heard on the radio that morning. He came back the next day, and the next, and every day after that for 5 years. Nobody taught him. There was no money for lessons, and even if there had been, Grace Cole would not have known where to find a piano teacher in their neighborhood. So Elijah taught himself. He watched videos on his mother's old phone, the one with the cracked screen and the battery that died every 2 hours. He watched a man in London explain scales and chord progressions. He watched a woman in Seoul demonstrate finger exercises. He watched concert recordings of pianists whose names he could barely pronounce, and he studied their hands the way a medical student studies anatomy. He paused, rewound, paused again, watching each finger land on each key, memorizing the shapes, the angles, the pressure. Then he went to the church basement and practiced until his fingers ached. He played scales until they were automatic. He played simple songs until they were perfect. Then he played harder songs, and harder ones after that. When he made mistakes, he went back to the beginning and started over. When his fingers cramped, he stretched them and kept going. When the old piano's stuck keys refused to cooperate, he learned to work around them, adjusting his fingering, adapting his technique, turning a limitation into a skill. By the time he was 10, he could play Mozart sonatas from memory. By 11, he was working through Beethoven. By 12, he had fallen in love with Chopin, with those long, singing melodies that sounded like someone crying and laughing at the same time. The Ballade No. 1 became his obsession. It was 12 minutes long, technically brutal, emotionally enormous, the kind of piece that professional pianists spent months preparing for recitals. Elijah learned it in the basement of a church, on a piano that was barely functional, with no teacher, no audience, and no reason to believe that anyone would ever hear him play it. But he learned it. Every note, every phrase, every dynamic shift, every moment of silence between the storms of sound. He did not just memorize it. He understood it. He felt it in his chest like a second heartbeat. And when he played it alone in that basement, with the bare bulb flickering overhead, and the sound of traffic bleeding through the small window near the ceiling, he was not a hungry kid in a bad neighborhood anymore. He was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the music took him, where nothing hurt and everything made sense. That was the version of himself he was trying to hold on to as he sat in the back of the Whitmore lobby, watching the other contestants warm up, tune their instruments, and receive last-minute encouragement from their parents. A boy about his age walked past carrying a violin case that probably cost more than everything Elijah owned combined. The boy's father walked beside him, one hand on his shoulder, leaning down to say something that made the boy smile. Elijah watched them and felt something tighten behind his ribs. Not jealousy exactly. Something more like longing. A wish so deep he had stopped putting it into words a long time ago. A woman with a clipboard appeared at the edge of the waiting area. Contestants 40 through 65, please move to the backstage holding area. You'll be performing in the second half. Elijah stood up. His legs felt unsteady. The hunger and the nerves were mixing together into something that made the room tilt slightly, like a ship in gentle waves. He followed the group of contestants through a side door, down a narrow corridor with concrete walls, and into a room with folding chairs and a monitor showing the stage. On the monitor, a girl was playing cello. She was maybe 14, with red hair pulled back in a braid, and she played with a focus so intense that Elijah could feel it through the screen. When she finished, the audience applauded warmly, and the judges made notes on their clipboards. The next contestant was a boy who played trumpet, then a girl who played flute, then a pair of siblings who performed a duet on matching guitars. Each one was good, polished, prepared. They played with the kind of clean, confident precision that comes from years of private lessons, summer music camps, and parents who understand the difference between a quarter note and an eighth note. Elijah sat in his folding chair and watched them all, and felt the fear growing inside him like a living thing, something with teeth and claws that was trying to eat him from the inside out. He did not have lessons. He did not have a teacher. He did not have a parent in the audience. He had a church basement piano and a cracked phone and 5 years of teaching himself in the dark. What was he doing here? The question circled his mind like a bird that would not land. He pressed his fingers against his knees and played invisible keys on his own legs, running through the opening measures of the Chopin. The muscle memory was there. His fingers knew where to go, but his brain was flooding with doubt, and doubt was a poison that could paralyze even the steadiest hands. He thought about his mother. If she knew he was here, she would be terrified. Not because she did not want him to succeed, but because she knew what the world did to people like them when they reached too high. She had watched it happen to his father. Elijah barely remembered the man. Just a shadow, a voice, a feeling of warmth that disappeared when he was 3. His father had been a musician too. A guitarist who played in bars and clubs around the city, who was always chasing the next gig, the next break, the next chance. He chased until there was nothing left to chase, and then he was gone. Grace never spoke about him. When Elijah asked, her face closed like a door, and he learned to stop asking. But he had inherited his father's ears, his father's hands, his father's need to make music the way other people needed to breathe. And unlike his father, Elijah had no illusions about what the world owed him. The world owed him nothing. He knew that. He had always known that. He just wanted a chance. Just one. Just 12 minutes on a stage with a piano. To show someone, anyone, that the sound in his head was real. Contestant 61. The woman with the clipboard called. "You're on deck. 5 minutes." Elijah stood up. The room swayed. He realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to exhale. He walked to the door that led to the stage wings and stood there, looking out at the edge of the curtain, listening to the muffled sound of the current performer finishing their piece. Applause. Then silence. Then the host's voice, smooth and practiced, thanking the performer and introducing the next one. The woman with the clipboard touched his shoulder. "You're up, honey. What are you performing today?" "Chopin," Elijah said. His voice came out smaller than he wanted. "Ballade number 1. The woman's eyebrows went up, just slightly, just for a second, but Elijah saw it. He saw the doubt. The same doubt that lived in the security guard's eyes, in the lobby receptionist's eyes, in the eyes of every person who looked at his clothes and his shoes and his skinny frame, and made their calculations. "All right," she said, and her voice was carefully neutral. "Go ahead whenever you're ready." Elijah walked out of the wings and into the light. The stage was bigger than he had imagined. From the lobby, from the monitor in the holding room, it had seemed manageable. Just a raised platform with curtains and lights. But standing on it was different. The space stretched out around him in every direction, vast and exposed, and the lights hit him like the sun breaking through clouds, hot and blinding. He could not see the audience, not clearly, but he could feel them. 300 people, maybe more, sitting in the darkness beyond the lights, watching him. And what they saw was a boy who did not look like he belonged. He knew this because of the sound that reached him almost immediately. It started small, a rustle of whispers, the way dry leaves move when the wind first picks up. Then a low murmur, voices overlapping, and underneath it something sharper. A laugh, quiet, quickly stifled, but unmistakable. Then another one, less carefully hidden. And then a third, this one open and careless, the kind of laugh that is not meant to be cruel but is cruel anyway, because it says everything without using words. It says, "What is this?" It says, "Who let him in here?" It says, "This is going to be embarrassing." Elijah heard all of it. He had spent his whole life listening. When you grow up the way he did, in small apartments with thin walls, in neighborhoods where you need to know which footsteps on the stairs mean trouble, and which ones mean your mother is finally home, you develop ears that miss nothing. He heard the whispers and the laughter, and each one hit him like a small stone thrown at glass. He kept walking. The piano was at the center of the stage, a full concert grand, black and gleaming under the lights. It was the most beautiful instrument he had ever seen. He had never played a grand piano before. The church basement upright was the only piano he had ever touched. This instrument was 8 feet long, perfectly tuned, with keys that were smooth and white and unblemished. It probably cost more than his mother would earn in 20 years. He reached the bench and stood beside it. The host, a tall man in a dark suit named Philip Crane, was standing at a microphone near the side of the stage. He looked at Elijah, then looked at his clipboard, then looked at Elijah again. "Contestant 61, Philip said, and there was a pause before he continued, a half-second of empty air that carried its own meaning. Performing a solo piano piece. That was all. No introduction, no background, no mention of the piece itself. Every other contestant had received a brief biography. Their name, their age, their music school, their teacher's name, their previous competitions and awards. Elijah had none of those things to offer. His registration form had been almost entirely blank. Name, Elijah Cole. Age, 12. School, Lincoln Middle. Teacher, none. Previous competitions, none. Philip stepped back, and the stage belonged to Elijah. He sat down on the bench. It was too high. He reached underneath and found the adjustment knob and lowered it, and the mechanical clicking sound echoed through the silent hall like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. When the bench was at the right height, he placed his hands in his lap and looked at the keyboard. 88 keys, black and white. The most honest instrument in the world, because a piano does not lie. It does not flatter the player or forgive mistakes. Every note that comes out of it is exactly what the player puts in. Nothing more, nothing less. Elijah stared at those keys. And for a terrible moment, his mind went completely blank. The notes he had memorized, the fingerings he had drilled thousands of times, the emotional map of the piece he knew, as well as he knew his own heartbeat. All of it disappeared, wiped clean like chalk from a blackboard. Panic surged through him, cold and electric, and his hands began to tremble again. In the audience, someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their seat with a creak of leather. The silence was becoming uncomfortable, stretching beyond the natural pause before a performance into something awkward, something that confirmed what everyone was already thinking. The boy is frozen. The boy does not know what he is doing. The boy should not be here. The judges sat in the front row. There were 3 of them. The head judge was a woman named Dr. Catherine Marsh, the chair of the music department at the State University, a former concert pianist who had performed at Carnegie Hall twice before she was 30, and who had spent the last 2 decades turning talented students into professionals. Beside her sat Leonard Price, a composer and arranger who had written film scores and Broadway orchestrations, and who wore a bow tie and glasses with thick black frames. The third judge was a young woman named Sophie Brennan, a rising star in the classical music world, a violinist who had won international competitions, and who was here tonight as a guest judge because her manager thought it would be good publicity. Dr. Marsh was watching Elijah with an expression that was neither kind nor unkind. It was simply attentive. She had been judging competitions like this for 15 years, and she had seen everything. Prodigies who crumbled under pressure, average students who rose to the occasion, and occasionally, very rarely, something that nobody saw coming. She did not know which category this boy would fall into. She only knew that he had been sitting at the piano for nearly 30 seconds without playing a note, and that was usually not a good sign. Leonard Price glanced at his watch. Sophie Brennan uncrossed and recrossed her legs. In the audience, a man in the 4th row leaned toward his wife and whispered, "This is painful." His wife nodded. Their daughter had performed 20 minutes earlier, a technically perfect rendition of a Debussy prelude, and they were waiting for the results with the satisfied confidence of people who had invested $14,000 in private lessons over the past 3 years. 6 rows back, a woman was filming on her phone. Her name was Karen Liu, and she was not a music critic or a talent scout or anyone of particular importance. She was a receptionist at a dental office who had come to the showcase because her nephew was performing later in the program. She had started filming when she saw Elijah walk on stage, partly out of curiosity and partly because something about the boy caught her attention. She could not have said what it was. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, straight-backed and steady despite the clothes that did not fit, like a soldier walking into battle without armor. She kept her phone raised and the camera rolling. On the stage, Elijah was drowning. The panic was a wave, and he was under it, and the surface was getting farther away. His mind raced through fragments of thought. The laughter, his mother on her knees scrubbing floors, the flyer on the telephone pole, $50 in coins and crumpled bills, 5 years in a church basement, the old piano with its stuck keys and its thin, tinny sound that was nothing like this magnificent instrument in front of him. And then, without deciding to, without thinking about it at all, he thought about the music itself, not the notes on the page, not the fingerings he had memorized, not the technical demands of the piece. He thought about what the music meant, what Chopin had poured into those 12 minutes of sound. Longing, loss, the ache of being far from home, of loving something you cannot hold, of carrying a sadness so deep it becomes its own kind of beauty. Elijah knew that feeling. He had lived inside it every day of his life. His hands rose from his lap and settled onto the keys. His left hand found the G. His right hand found the shape of the opening phrase. He took one breath, slow and deep, the way a diver breathes before going under. And then he played. The first note of the Ballade No. 1 is a single G in the bass, played softly, almost like a question. It is followed by a rising phrase that sounds like someone beginning to tell a story they have carried inside them for a very long time. Elijah played that opening, and the sound that came out of the concert grand was so different from the sound of the church basement piano that for a moment he almost lost himself in the sheer beauty of it. The tone was rich and full and warm, like sunlight pouring through stained glass, and it filled the hall the way water fills a vessel, finding every corner, every empty space. The whispers stopped, the murmuring stopped. The couple in the 4th row, who had been leaning toward each other to exchange commentary, sat back in their seats. The man who had said, "This is painful," closed his mouth and did not open it again. Dr. Catherine Marsh set her pen down on the table. She did not pick it up for the next 12 minutes. Elijah played the opening section, the Largo, with a patience and a tenderness that no one in the hall expected. Each note was placed with care, like a word chosen precisely because no other word would do. The melody unfolded slowly, breathing, taking its time, and there was something in the way the boy played it that made the hair stand up on the back of Leonard Price's neck. It was not just accuracy, it was not just technique, it was understanding. The boy was not performing the music. He was speaking it, the way you speak your own language, naturally, without translation. The first theme developed, gained momentum, and Elijah moved with it. His fingers, the same fingers that had been trembling 30 seconds ago, now moved across the keys with a fluidity that seemed almost impossible. The transition from the opening into the moderato was seamless, a shift from gentle storytelling into something more urgent, more alive, like a river that starts as a stream and begins to widen and deepen and pick up speed. In the fourth row, the man who had whispered to his wife was now leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at the stage. His wife's hand was on his arm, and she was gripping it without realizing it. Sophie Brennan, the young violinist, felt her eyes begin to sting. She blinked, confused. She had sat through hundreds of performances in her career and had developed the professional detachment that comes with experience. Music was her job. It was craft, technique, interpretation, execution. She analyzed it the way an engineer analyzes a bridge. But what this boy was doing on that stage, was bypassing her professional filters entirely and hitting something underneath, something she had almost forgotten was there. Elijah reached the second theme, the waltz-like melody in E-flat major, and the hall seemed to fill with light. It was a passage of pure lyrical beauty, a moment of hope and warmth in the middle of something darker, and the boy played it with a sweetness that was almost unbearable. His eyes were closed now. He was not looking at the keys. He did not need to. His hands knew where to go the way a bird knows where to fly, not through thought but through something deeper, something wired into the bone and blood. The audience had gone absolutely still. Not the polite stillness of an attentive crowd, but the stunned, breathless stillness of people witnessing something they do not fully understand. 300 people sat in the dark, and not one of them moved, not one of them coughed, not one of them reached for their phone. They were held in place by the sound, pinned there, unable to look away or tune out or think about anything else. Karen Liu, the dental receptionist with the phone camera, had tears running down her face. She did not wipe them. She did not want to move the phone. Backstage, the woman with the clipboard had stopped checking her list. She was standing in the wings, one hand pressed against the wall, watching through the gap in the curtain. Two other contestants, waiting for their turns, had come to stand beside her. One of them, a 15-year-old cellist named Andrew, was holding his bow in one hand and staring at the stage with an expression that mixed awe and something that looked like fear. Not fear of Elijah, fear that he had just understood something about music that years of lessons had never taught him. The piece moved into its development section, and this was where the technical demands escalated sharply. Rapid passages, wide leaps, dense chords, rhythmic complexity that would challenge a conservatory student with decades of training. Elijah played through all of it without hesitation, without error, without the mechanical stiffness that usually accompanies extreme technical difficulty. His hands moved with a freedom that seemed to defy what should have been possible for a 12-year-old who had never had a lesson. The fast passages were crystalline, every note distinct and purposeful. The loud sections were powerful without being harsh. The soft sections were intimate, as if the boy were whispering a secret to each person in the audience individually. Dr. Marsh had been a musician for over 40 years. She had heard the Chopin ballades performed by some of the greatest pianists alive. She had studied the scores, analyzed the harmonic structures, written academic papers on Chopin's compositional techniques. She thought she knew everything there was to know about this piece, but sitting in the front row of the Whitmore Performing Arts Center, listening to a 12-year-old boy in a faded polo shirt play it on a borrowed stage, she realized she was hearing something she had never heard before. Not a better technical performance, not a more accurate reading of the score, something else entirely. A connection between the player and the music that was so direct, so unmediated by training or tradition or expectation, that it felt like eavesdropping on a private conversation. The boy was not interpreting Chopin. He was channeling him. He was living inside the music, and the music was living inside him, and the boundary between the two had dissolved completely. Leonard Price took off his glasses and cleaned them on his tie. His hands were not steady. The piece built toward its climax, the coda, where the music gathers all its energy and emotion and releases it in a cascade of sound that is both devastating and exhilarating. Elijah played the ascending runs with a ferocity that rattled the air in the hall. His body leaned into the piano, his shoulders moving with the force of the chords, his face tight with concentration, and something beyond concentration, something that looked like need. The music poured out of him in waves, crashing and receding, and crashing again, and the audience was caught in it like swimmers in a riptide, pulled forward, pulled under, unable to resist. A woman in the 7th row was sobbing. She covered her mouth with both hands, but the sound still escaped, small and broken, and the man beside her put his arm around her shoulders and held her, and his eyes were wet too. The final measures of the ballade number 1 are a storm. Crashing chords, thundering bass, a fury of sound that seems to consume everything in its path. And then, at the very end, silence. A silence that is not empty but full, charged with everything that came before it, vibrating with aftermath. Elijah played the last chord. The sound rang out through the hall, huge and resonant, and then it faded, slowly, degree by degree, like a wave pulling back from the shore. His hands stayed on the keys. His eyes were still closed. The last vibration died away into nothing. Silence. For 3 full seconds, the hall was silent. Not the silence of an audience waiting to applaud, but the silence of 300 people who have forgotten how to move, how to breathe, how to do anything except sit in the wreckage of what they have just experienced. Then one person clapped, a single pair of hands, somewhere near the back of the hall. Then another. Then 10 more. Then 50. Then the entire audience was on its feet, every single person standing, and the applause was not polite or appreciative but explosive. A roar of sound that shook the walls, that bounced off the ceiling and the floor, and came back and hit again. People were shouting, people were crying, people were turning to the strangers beside them with wild eyes, grabbing arms, saying, "Did you hear that? Did you hear what just happened?" Elijah opened his eyes. The light was blinding. The sound was overwhelming. He could not see the faces in the audience, but he could feel the energy coming off them in waves, a heat that had nothing to do with the stage lights. He sat on the bench, his hands still resting on the keys, and he did not know what to do. Nobody had ever applauded for him before. Nobody had ever stood up for him before. He had spent his entire life being invisible, and suddenly 300 people were looking at him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. He stood up. His legs were trembling. He bowed, quickly and awkwardly, the way someone bows when they have never been taught how, and the applause grew louder. He walked off the stage, and the applause followed him, pouring through the curtain and into the wings, where the woman with the clipboard was pressing both hands against her chest, and the cellist named Andrew was standing perfectly still, with tears streaming down his face. Elijah walked past them, down the corridor, and into the holding room. He sat down in a folding chair in the corner. He put his hands on his knees, and he did something he had not done since he was 7 years old, since the night he asked his mother where his father was and she turned away without answering. He cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, with his shoulders shaking and his breath hitching, and tears falling onto his hands, which were still warm from the keys, which could still feel the ghost of every note. He cried because the music had unlocked something inside him, a door he kept bolted shut most of the time because opening it was too dangerous, and now it was wide open and everything was pouring out. The loneliness, the hunger, the years of playing in a basement with no one listening, the fear that he would spend his whole life unheard, and now, suddenly, impossibly, the opposite of all that. The sound of 300 people telling him that they heard, that they understood, that what he carried inside him was real and true and worth something. He sat in that chair and cried until there was nothing left, and then he wiped his face with the back of his hand and breathed in slowly, and the world reassembled itself around him, solid and ordinary and unchanged, except that everything had changed. The remaining contestants performed. Elijah did not watch them. He sat in the corner and stared at the floor and waited. And the waiting was its own kind of agony, because he did not know what happened next. He had poured everything he had into those 12 minutes, every note, every feeling, every ounce of strength and skill and heart, and now he was empty. He had nothing left to give. An hour later, the performances were over. Philip Crane returned to the stage and thanked the audience, and the judges and the sponsors, and everyone else who needed thanking. Then he said the judges would deliberate and announce the results shortly. The deliberation took 4 minutes. It was the shortest deliberation in the history of the Whitmore Showcase. Philip Crane returned to the microphone. He had an envelope in his hand. He opened it, read the contents, and looked up with an expression that was part smile and part something deeper. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "our third-place winner, for her exceptional cello performance of the Dvorak Concerto, is Miss Hannah Price." Applause. A girl with red hair walked onto the stage and accepted her trophy. "Our second-place winner, for his outstanding trumpet performance, is Mr. Daniel Frey." More applause. A boy in a navy blazer joined Hannah on the stage. "And our first-place winner." Philip paused. The hall went quiet. By the unanimous decision of all 3 judges, the winner of this year's Whitmore Young Musicians Showcase receiving the $5,000 grand prize and a featured performance at the city's annual arts festival, is contestant number 61. He looked toward the wings. Elijah Cole. The audience erupted, not just applause this time, but cheering, whistling, stamping feet. People who had laughed when he walked out were now shouting his name, a name they had learned 60 seconds ago, as if they had known him their whole lives. The irony was not lost on Elijah, but he did not have time to think about it because the woman with the clipboard was pushing him gently toward the stage, and his legs were moving on their own, and then he was standing in the light again, and Philip Crane was putting a trophy in his hands. It was heavier than he expected, gold-colored, shaped like a lyre, mounted on a wooden base with a brass plate that read, "First Place." He held it with both hands and looked at it, and his reflection looked back at him from the polished surface, and the boy he saw did not look like the boy who had walked through the back door of this building 2 hours ago. That boy had been small and afraid and invisible. This boy was standing in a spotlight, holding proof that he existed. Dr. Catherine Marsh came to the stage. She shook Elijah's hand, and her grip was firm and warm, and she looked into his eyes with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Where did you study?" she asked. "I didn't," Elijah said. She stared at him. "You taught yourself that Chopin." It was not a question, but he answered anyway. "Yes, ma'am." She shook her head slowly, the way people do when they encounter something that rearranges their understanding of the world. "I have been teaching piano for 22 years, she said. "I have never heard anything like what you did tonight." Then she did something that surprised everyone who saw it, including herself. She hugged him, right there on the stage, in front of the audience, and the cameras, and the other judges, and the other contestants. She put her arms around this skinny 12-year-old boy in his faded polo shirt and held him for a moment, and when she stepped back, her eyes were bright with tears. The audience cheered louder. Backstage, after the ceremony, people surrounded him. Parents of other contestants, audience members who had come through the stage door, the host, the judges, strangers with business cards and questions and offers. Elijah stood in the middle of it all, clutching his trophy, overwhelmed, unable to process the sheer volume of attention after a lifetime of none. But one voice cut through the noise, a man's voice, calm and clear, coming from a tall, gray-haired figure who moved through the crowd, with the quiet authority of someone who was used to rooms making space for him. His name was Professor George Whitfield, and he was the dean of the Redmond Conservatory of Music, one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. He had not been planning to attend the showcase. He had come as a favor to a colleague, intending to stay for 20 minutes, listen to a few performances and leave. He had stayed for the entire program because of contestant 61. "Elijah," Professor Whitfield said, and his voice was gentle, the kind of gentle that comes not from softness but from understanding. "I would like to speak with your parents." "It's just my mom," Elijah said. "She's at work." "When does she finish?" "Late." Professor Whitfield nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card. "Give this to your mother. Tell her I would like to offer you a full scholarship to the Redmond Conservatory. Tuition, housing, meals, instrument access, everything. No cost to your family." Elijah looked at the card. The letters blurred because his eyes were filling again, and he blinked hard and read the name printed in clean black font. Professor George Whitfield, Dean of Students, Redmond Conservatory of Music. "I don't understand," Elijah said. "You will," Professor Whitfield said. "What you played tonight, that is not something that can be taught. Technique can be taught. Theory can be taught. But what you have, the thing that made 300 people stand up and weep, that comes from somewhere else entirely. And it is my job to make sure the world gets to hear it." Elijah held the card in one hand and the trophy in the other, and stood in the fluorescent light of the backstage corridor, and for the first time in his life, the future was not a blank wall. It was a door. And it was open. He rode the bus home. The trophy sat on his lap, and people stared at it, and a woman across the aisle smiled at him and asked what he won, and he said, "A music competition," and she said, "Good for you, honey," and went back to her phone. The bus rattled through the city, past the downtown towers and the shopping districts and the neighborhoods that got older and smaller and darker the farther you went from the center, until it reached the stop 4 blocks from his apartment. He walked home through the dark. The streetlight on his corner was broken again, and the only light came from the neon sign of the laundromat downstairs and the blue flicker of televisions behind curtained windows. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, unlocked the apartment door, and stepped inside. The apartment was dark and quiet. His mother was not home yet. He put the trophy on the kitchen table, next to the unpaid bills and the empty coffee mug from this morning. He put Professor Whitfield's card beside it. Then he sat down at the table and waited. Grace Cole came home at 11:45. She was wearing her hotel uniform, navy blue pants and a white polo shirt with the Regency logo on the breast pocket. Her shoes were the cheap sneakers she bought at the discount store, and the soles were wearing thin. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and there were circles under her eyes the color of bruises. She set her bag on the counter, turned on the kitchen light, and saw her son sitting at the table. "Baby," she said, "what are you doing up?" Then she saw the trophy. She stood very still. Her eyes moved from the trophy to Elijah's face and back again. She picked up the trophy and read the plate. First place, Whitmore Young Musicians Showcase, Elijah Cole. "What is this?" she said. It was not a question. It was a sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest, from the place where she kept all the things she could not afford to feel. Elijah told her everything. The flyer on the telephone pole, the 3 months of saving coins and doing odd jobs, the registration, the bus ride downtown, the stage, the lights, the laughter, the piano, the music, the applause, the trophy, Professor Whitfield and his card. Grace picked up the card and read it. She read it again. She put it down and picked it up and read it a third time. Then she sank into the chair beside her son and pulled him against her, and held him so tight that he could feel her heartbeat through both their shirts. And she whispered into his hair words that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "I always knew," she said. "Baby, I always knew." They sat like that for a long time, in the small kitchen of their small apartment, with the trophy gleaming under the fluorescent light, and the card from the Redmond Conservatory propped against the sugar bowl, while the city breathed and murmured outside the window in the future, vast and terrifying and full of possibility, waited for them on the other side of the night. 6 blocks away, in the basement of the Greater Hope Community Church, the old upright piano sat in the darkness. Its keys were still and silent. A water stain stretched across its top. 3 of its hammers were bare. It was not a beautiful instrument. It was not a valuable instrument. But it was the instrument that had given Elijah Cole his voice, and tomorrow morning, when the sun came through the small basement window and lit up the dust motes floating in the air, it would be waiting for him, the way it had always waited, patient and faithful and ready. But Elijah would not come tomorrow. He would not need to, because tonight, for the first time, the music had left the basement. It had walked out into the world, stood under the lights, and spoken so loudly that no one could pretend they had not heard. And the world, whether it was ready or not, had listened. Meanwhile, something else was happening that Elijah knew nothing about. Karen Liu, the dental receptionist who had filmed his performance on her phone, was sitting in her car in the parking lot of the Whitmore Center, staring at her screen. She had watched the video back 3 times already. The quality was not great, the angle was slightly crooked, the audio was tinny and the lighting was washed out. But the performance came through. Even on a phone screen, even with compressed audio and shaky footage, the power of what the boy had done on that stage was undeniable. Karen was not a person who did things impulsively. She was methodical and cautious, and she thought carefully before making decisions, which is why she was good at scheduling dental appointments and bad at dating. But something about this video made her fingers move before her brain gave permission. She opened her social media account, the one she mostly used to share pictures of her cat and recipes she never actually cooked, and she uploaded the video with a caption that she wrote in 30 seconds and did not edit. "Was at the Whitmore Music Showcase tonight to see my nephew play. This kid walked on stage in clothes that didn't fit. No sheet music, no teacher, nothing. The audience laughed at him. Then he sat down and played piano like nothing I've ever heard. I can't stop crying. Watch this." She posted it at 11:17 in the evening and put her phone in her purse and drove home and fed her cat and went to bed without checking it again. By midnight, the video had 200 views. By 2 in the morning, it had 4,000. By 6 in the morning, when Karen's alarm went off and she picked up her phone to turn it off, the video had been viewed 312,000 times. Her phone was vibrating non-stop with notifications, comments, shares, reposts, messages from strangers. She sat up in bed and scrolled through the numbers with her mouth open, and her cat jumped onto the pillow and meowed in her ear, and she did not hear it, because the numbers kept climbing. 312,000 people had watched Elijah Cole play Chopin at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and the number was doubling every hour. By the time Elijah woke up the next morning in his small bedroom, in his small apartment, with the trophy still on the kitchen table and the sunlight coming through the window at the same angle it always did, the video had been viewed over 2 million times, and his life, though he did not know it yet, would never be the same again. The phone call came at 7:30 in the morning. Grace was already awake, already dressed for work, standing at the kitchen counter pouring coffee into a thermos when the old landline on the wall rang. She picked it up and said hello, and a voice she did not recognize asked if this was the mother of Elijah Cole. "Who is this?" Grace said, and her hand tightened on the thermos, because phone calls from strangers were rarely good news in her experience. The voice belonged to a producer at the local news station. She said her name was Rebecca Palmer, and she wanted to know if she could send a camera crew to the apartment. "A camera crew," Grace repeated, as if the words were in a language she did not speak. "There is a video of your son playing piano at the Whitmore showcase," Rebecca said. "It has been viewed over 2 million times since last night. It is the most watched video in the state right now. National outlets are picking it up. We would love to be the first to tell his story." Grace set the thermos down. She looked at the trophy on the table. She looked at the card from Professor Whitfield. She looked at her son's closed bedroom door. 2 million, she said. "And climbing," Rebecca said. Grace Cole had spent 12 years protecting her son from a world that did not care about him. She had built walls around their small life, not because she wanted to keep him trapped, but because she wanted to keep him safe. She had watched his father chase dreams until the dreams consumed him, and she had sworn she would not let the same thing happen to Elijah. But standing in her kitchen at 7:30 in the morning, holding a telephone that was bringing the outside world crashing through her carefully constructed walls, she understood that the choice was no longer hers to make. The music had escaped. It was out there now, in the phones and screens of millions of strangers, and there was no calling it back. "Let me talk to my son," she said, and hung up. She knocked on Elijah's door. He was already awake, lying in bed staring at the ceiling. He had not slept well. His mind kept replaying the performance, every note, every moment of silence, the sound of laughter turning into the sound of applause. "Come to the kitchen," Grace said. "There is something we need to talk about." She told him about the phone call, about the video, about 2 million views. Elijah listened, and his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, fear, and something else. Something that looked like the first light of dawn breaking over a dark landscape. "What do we do?" he asked. Grace sat down across from him. She reached across the table and took both his hands in hers. Her hands were rough and calloused from years of cleaning, but her grip was steady and warm. "We do whatever you want to do," she said. "This is your music, your choice." It was the first time in his life that anyone had said those words to him. Your choice. In a life defined by scarcity, by limitations, by the absence of options, choice was the greatest luxury of all. Elijah looked at the trophy. He looked at the card from the conservatory. He looked at his mother's tired, beautiful face. "I want people to hear me play," he said. Grace nodded. She squeezed his hands once, hard, and then let go. She picked up the phone and called Rebecca Palmer back. "Send the camera," she said. The news crew arrived at 9. They set up in the apartment's small living room, moving furniture to make space for lights and tripods. And Elijah sat on the couch in the same faded polo shirt he had worn the night before, because it was the best one he owned. Rebecca Palmer asked him questions, and he answered them in his quiet, careful voice, and the camera captured everything. The small apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the trophy on the table, the boy with the extraordinary hands and the extraordinary story. The segment aired at noon. By 1 o'clock, every major news outlet in the country had picked it up. By 3 o'clock, the video of his performance had crossed 10 million views. By evening, Elijah Cole's name was the most searched term on the internet. The calls started coming: talent agencies, recording labels, television producers, concert promoters, philanthropic organizations. Every one of them wanted a piece of the boy who had walked out of nowhere and played piano like the world was ending. Grace sat at the kitchen table with the phone ringing non-stop and a legal pad full of names and numbers, and she felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at something she could not measure. Professor Whitfield called that evening. His voice was the same calm, steady presence it had been the night before, and Grace held on to the sound of it like a rope in rough water. "I saw the news coverage," he said. "Things are going to move very fast now. You are going to be approached by many people with many offers, and most of them will not have Elijah's best interests at heart. I want you to know that my offer stands. The scholarship is real, it is unconditional, and it will be here whenever Elijah is ready." "When does the term start?" Grace asked. "September," he said, "but there is no rush. Take your time, talk to your son, and if you need advice navigating any of this, you can call me, day or night." Grace wrote his number on the legal pad and circled it 3 times. In the days that followed, the world came for Elijah Cole with the full force of its attention, which is both a gift and a weapon. and the difference between the two depends entirely on how you hold it. Interview requests piled up. A morning show wanted him to perform live. A documentary filmmaker wanted to follow him for 6 months. A piano manufacturer offered to donate a brand new grand piano to his apartment, which would have been generous except that the piano would not have fit through the front door, or the stairwell, or indeed anywhere in the building. A clothing company offered to sponsor him, which meant dressing him in their brand and putting his face on their advertisements, and Grace hung up on that one before they finished the pitch. Elijah navigated all of it with a quiet steadiness that surprised everyone except the people who knew him. He did not become arrogant. He did not become difficult. He did not develop the brittle, performing confidence that child prodigies often use as armor against a world that wants to consume them. He stayed the same boy he had always been, quiet, watchful, thoughtful, with hands that trembled slightly before a performance and a mind that came alive at the keyboard. He did the morning show. He sat on a bright couch next to a host with very white teeth and answered questions about his life. And then he played. Not the Chopin this time, but a Beethoven sonata, the Pathétique, because he wanted to show that the Whitmore performance was not a fluke, that the music inside him was not limited to one piece or one night. When he finished, the host was crying, and the crew was crying, and the studio audience of 200 people was on its feet, and the video of the performance went viral again, and the cycle continued. But the most important thing that happened in those first weeks was not the fame, or the attention, or the offers. It was something much smaller and much quieter, and it happened on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after the Whitmore showcase, in the basement of the Greater Hope Community Church. Elijah went back. He had not been to the church since the competition, not because he had forgotten about it, but because every day had been filled with phone calls and interviews and meetings that left him exhausted and disoriented. But on Sunday morning, while his mother slept, he walked the 4 blocks to the church, went in through the side door, down the concrete stairs, and into the basement. The piano was there, of course it was. It had not moved. It had not changed. The water stain was the same. The stuck keys were the same. The bare light bulb overhead cast the same yellow glow. Elijah sat down on the bench, and the familiar creak of the old wood was like a voice welcoming him home. He played, not Chopin, not Beethoven, not any piece he had memorized or performed. He just played. Random notes at first, then fragments of melodies, then something that was entirely his own, a piece of music that had no name and no structure and no purpose except to exist. He played softly, then loudly, then softly again, following the music wherever it wanted to go, and the sound of the old piano, thin and slightly out of tune and utterly imperfect, was the most beautiful sound in the world to him. He played for 2 hours. Nobody heard him, nobody filmed him, nobody stood up and cheered, and when he was done, he sat on the bench in the silence, and felt something settle inside him, a weight finding its center, a compass needle pointing north. This was who he was, not the boy on television. Not the viral video, not the prodigy, the sensation, the story. He was a boy who played piano because he could not stop, because the music was not something he did but something he was, woven into the fabric of him like the threads of a cloth, inseparable, essential, alive. He left the church and walked home through the warm morning air, and the city moved around him, traffic and voices and the distant sound of church bells, and he carried the music inside him the way he always had, quietly, fiercely, like a fire that does not need an audience to burn. September came. Grace Cole took a leave of absence from the hotel, the first time off she had taken in 7 years. She packed 2 suitcases, one for her and one for Elijah. They rode a bus to the Redmond Conservatory, a 4-hour journey through the countryside, and when they arrived, Elijah looked up at the campus, the stone buildings, the practice halls, the concert auditorium with its tall windows and slate roof, and he said nothing. He just looked, the way you look at something you have imagined so many times that seeing it in reality feels like waking up from a dream. Professor Whitfield met them at the entrance. He shook Grace's hand and told her that her son was going to change the way people thought about music. Grace looked at him with the steady, unreadable expression she had perfected over 12 years of raising a child alone, in a world that offered no guarantees. "Just take care of him," she said. "I will," Professor Whitfield said. And he meant it. Elijah started classes. For the first time in his life, he had a real teacher. He had a real piano, a beautiful Steinway in a practice room with soundproofed walls and good lighting, and a bench that was the right height. He had classmates who spoke his language, who understood the difference between playing notes and making music, who stayed up late arguing about tempo and phrasing and whether Liszt was a genius or a showman. He learned things he had never known: theory, harmony, counterpoint, music history, sight reading, ear training. He learned that the intuitive understanding he had developed in the church basement was remarkably close to what trained musicians spent years acquiring, but it had gaps and blind spots that proper instruction could fill. He was a sponge. He absorbed everything, and the things he absorbed deepened and enriched the music that was already inside him, adding layers and colors and textures to something that had always been raw and powerful and real. His first recital at the conservatory was 6 weeks after he arrived. He played the Chopin Ballade again, because Professor Whitfield asked him to, because the professor wanted the other students and faculty to hear what he had heard in that viral video, live and unmediated and right there in the room. The recital hall at Redmond seated 400 people. It was full. Faculty, students, local music lovers, reporters, a few people who had driven hours to see the boy from the video. Elijah walked onto the stage, and this time no one laughed. He sat down at the Steinway, and this time his hands did not tremble. He played. And it was better. The church basement had given him the soul of the music. The conservatory was giving him the tools to express that soul with greater precision, greater range, greater power. The performance was not just raw emotion anymore. It was raw emotion shaped by understanding, controlled by technique, amplified by knowledge. It was a wildfire that had learned to burn in the shape of a cathedral. When he finished, the audience stood. They always stood now. But this time, Elijah stood too. And he did not look away from the light. He looked into it. He looked through it, at the faces beyond, at the people who had come to hear him, who would carry the memory of this sound out into their lives and be changed by it in ways both large and small. He was 13 years old. He had a long way to go. He knew that. There would be harder pieces, bigger stages, tougher audiences, moments of doubt and exhaustion and failure. There would be times when the music would not come, when the keys would feel dead under his fingers, when the silence in his head would be the wrong kind of silence, empty and frightening instead of full and expectant. He knew all of that. But he also knew something else. Something he had learned not in a classroom or a practice room, but in the basement of a church, alone, in the dark, with nothing but an old piano and a cracked phone, and a need so deep it had no bottom. He knew that the music was stronger than the silence. It was stronger than the doubt, stronger than the hunger, stronger than the laughter, stronger than the distance between where he came from and where he was going. It was the strongest thing he had ever found, and it was his, and no one could take it from him, not ever, no matter what happened next. Elijah Cole walked off the stage and into his life, and the music walked with him, the way it always had, the way it always would, steady and faithful and infinite, a river that had no end. And somewhere far away, in the basement of the Greater Hope Community Church, the old upright piano sat in its pool of yellow light, silent and still, its work finally done. It had given everything it had to a boy who needed it, and now the boy was gone, out in the world, carrying the gift forward, making the sound that the old piano had always known was inside him, even when nobody else could hear it. The keys were still, the hammers were bare. The water stain stretched across the top like a map of a country that did not exist. But if you listened carefully, if you pressed your ear against the worn wood and held your breath and waited, you might have heard it. A faint vibration, a hum, the ghost of a G in the bass, soft and low, like a question that had finally been answered.